Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to our Global Environmental Justice Conference. And in this particular session, we are going to discuss reimagining climate change resilience through heritage with Andrea Richards and Kevin Farmer. And just a little bit of background about this particular session. The Caribbean's heritage spans approximately 5,000 years and represents one of humanity's greatest contexts for human-environment relationships highlighted through forced encounter and migration. Cultural heritage is impacted by the changing climate, impacts climate change, and how we respond to this change. The societies created remain with us and have multiple narratives and vocalities for us to learn from. To learn, we must focus on the role of culture as an agent of social change and a crucial actor in building future resilience. Now, I'm happy to be here as the moderator for two very distinguished people from Barbados, are living in Barbados. And I would like to first introduce who I consider a brother of mine, Mr. Kevin Farmer. Kevin Farmer is currently the Deputy Director of the Barbados Museum and Historical Society. As Deputy Director of Barbados Museum, he has the responsibility for museum exhibition programming and capital campaign fundraising. He holds a master's degree in history from the University of West Indies, Cave Hill, Barbados, and has lectured in archaeology and the Department of History at the University of West Indies, St. Augustine, Trinidad, and taught at University of West Indies, Cave Hill, and their MA Heritage Studies program. Now, Ms. Andrea Richards is a Caribbean archaeologist presently working at the regional level on various initiatives targeting natural and cultural heritage being impacted by natural hazards and climate change, with a focus on mitigation and adaptation planning through culture, post-disaster needs, and vulnerability assessments, the safeguarding of living heritage and emergencies, and the synergies which exist between tangible and intangible, and in how islanders of the Caribbean respond to environmental change. Although Andrea's interests are wide in the heritage field, she also has a special interest in the sustainable use of heritage, the application of international heritage treaties in the Caribbean, and the movement of the region's cultural property. So with that, let me turn it over to our two distinguished guests for this, what I'm sure will be a very interesting, informative, and exciting presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Clinton. Good afternoon, everyone. Kevin and I are honored to be here today to speak to you on the relevance and value of integrating heritage in climate change adaptation discourse. At first glance, some of you may think that heritage is out of place within this wider dialogue on equitable climate finance and sustainable development for inclusive international development. However, we hope from our presentation today that there will be a better understanding and appreciation of the role of cultural heritage in reimagining our collective future within the context of our changing climate. Culture is central to who we are and how we respond to and adapt to challenges, including environmental ones. And already culture is central to SDG 13 and the action relevant to combat climate change, specifically the role of traditional ecological knowledge. And you've been hearing a lot about that these past 2 days. And also World Heritage Sites are being used in monitoring and adaptation pilot laboratories in relation to climate change mitigation and adaptation initiatives. So we are truly in an unprecedented era where islands such as those in the Caribbean are referred to and are seen where they are at the forefront of the impacts of our changing climate. And where islands are wondering what their future will look like and examining ways to better adapt and become more resilient in the face of this change. And we know that SIDS are often the first to feel the impact of global economic policies, extreme weather events, and climate change. So within this present discourse, There's very little to no place for heritage, and many even in our islands see little relevance in the integration and application of cultural related data to this process. Yet we noted that our cultural heritage is central to how we respond to this context. There is valuable data to be obtained from monitoring heritage sites, as well as the very important study of the place for traditional ecological knowledge and its integration within the climate science. As we know, and so in examining the place for heritage-related data for this discourse in the Caribbean, sort of a paradigm shift for us, it presents this role from the perspective of the value of archaeological research and the study of traditional ecological systems, and the possibility for integration within the climate science, creating an adaptation context that is grassroots for the region. So although countries around the world have slowly awakened to the relevance of cultural data in this process, this is still an area with scope for much more development in the Caribbean. And so we aim today to discuss this with you with perspectives from the Caribbean and specifically Barbados.
No, thank you. Now, when you speak about the Caribbean, in this context, I want to just offer a little bit of what is the pre-contact landscape of the region. The Caribbean's pre-contact history is divided into an archaic age, which is roughly 6,000 BC to 100 AD, early ceramic age period, and late ceramic age, which leads us into pre-contact around 1500. The earliest evidence for human occupation comes from the island of Trinidad at the time when it was still connected to the mainland, i.e. South America. The Caribbean archipelago was the last region of the New World to be settled by people prior to the arrival of the Europeans, and the first to be settled by those Europeans. Current landscapes of the region are products of human engagement over the last 4,000 to 8,000 years, depending on which portion of the archipelago is under consideration. And archaeologists today are increasingly working to study the nature of human-environment relations within that long-term perspective. For example, coring work has allowed archaeologists to access and assess human impacts on the adjustments to local and supra-local environmental settings. The islands of the pre-colonial Caribbean are characterized by a distinctly maritime orientation of its first settlers, who adapted to a great variety of natural environments and social circumstances. Caribbean islanders adapted to climatological fluctuations and other natural events, including storms and hurricanes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, earthquakes, and sea level changes, as well as drought. These extreme events altered the island's ecosystem with repercussions for human survival strategies. An example of this is how people adapted house structures to protect themselves from environmental hazards, such as hurricanes, earthquakes, and heat. Barbados is the easternmost island in the Lesser Antilles, and its remoteness has been central in the environmental processes which have shaped the island from habitation over these last 4,000 years. Very small island. It's relatively flat, local geology comprising non-volcanic sedimentary rocks such as limestone coral. These characteristics contribute to varying levels of coastal susceptibility, with, for example, the East Coast, which makes up 1/7 of the landmass of the island, being completely eroded of that coral cap. Higher levels of coastal erosion occurs in that area, and of course, leading to accelerated erosion in both historical and modern times. And at the same time, it is the space where we do have some evidence of pre-contact settlement, not only on the coast, but inland, and where there are at least 2 above ground sources of water. I can't say a river, the place is just too small. The Amerindian place name for Barbados is Ishiruganayim, red land with white teeth. And archaeological research has placed that habitation in the island from roughly around 2000 BC to 1500 AD. Settlements were primarily along the coast, near potable water and natural wetlands. There are some inland sites. Subsistence was centered around three main activities: a kanuko, a system of shifting cultivation, fishing and hunting, culling and collecting of wild plants. Kanuko plots are situated near the villages and possessed four main characteristics: accessibility, good drainage, light soils, and of course a secondary forest, which was to disappear with the introduction of sugarcane. Talk about that a little bit later. The latter, of course, is most important, as clearing of secondary forests was much preferred over that of virgin forests, which were left alone. Areas were cut, tree shrubs left to dry, they were then burned. This provided fertilizer for planted crops. And in such cleared areas, multi-cultivation was practiced. Nucleated settlement was a model used by the Amerindian people. Overall, that landscape of the prehistoric period was one where relatively small-scale clearing took place and the surrounding virgin forest left intact. The economic life phase of the inhabitants were predominantly marine and terrestrial in relation to food crops and protein obtained mainly from the sea due to the paucity of large land animals on land. For hunting. A heavily canopied landscape with intermittent cleared areas for habitation was the rule. This modification, of course, was to be radically altered, and the next wave of migrants, both willing and forced to the island, altered it considerably by the beginning of the 17th century. The introduction of sugar on the island took place over a 10-year period from 1640 to 1650. The map on screen is Ligon map of Barbados, roughly 1634, printed in 1650. Note the settlement along the coastline. Note very little settlement inland. Within 10 years, the introduction of the monocrop sugarcane completely altered and transformed this landscape. And for those of you who like Star Trek, think of this portion of our evolution as a terraforming of this island. We went from small farms of 10 to 70 acres to large plantations of between 100 to 300 acres in size. That virgin forest used by the Amerindian people was completely deforested within that decade. Work was carried out by initially indentured, then enslaved labor in the early decades of the 17th century, giving way by the end of the century to being worked by an entirely enslaved workforce. Remember that map, remember the settlement. This is the island 1650. Is there a pointer project? This is Bridgetown as the main port city. Note all of the trails leading out. You've got a radial network that is basically connecting all of these various plantations to those ports. Recognize that with the exception of 4 modern highways built in the 20th century, the road network on this island is set by 1650, 1670. Increase in total deforestation occurred. Island remained environmentally vulnerable due to this change to monoculture. This ensured profitability. New ventures saw changes in local governance, as well as a radial network. And that radial network and the manner in which sugar cultivation altered the landscape exists to today. Waterways were blocked, natural wetlands were drained, and land use pattern altered the landscape. A feature of the move to the monocrop system was the placement of irrigation and drainage wells into fields and mangroves in order to drain them so that they can become cultivatable. Barbados is the largest wetland, now only has a small portion remaining on the south coast, had its earliest impacts from the early 1700s, when a road was constructed through the sandbar, separating the wetland from the ocean, further restricting tidal exchanges. By the 18th century, those wetlands were part of a sugar plantation, which drained some of the wetlands to expose more land for sugar cultivation. In the late 1900s, a lake was dredged out of the remaining section to create a shooting pond for wildlife hunters. Barbados' success as sugar cultivation made it the blueprint for other islands to follow. And in the 18th and 19th century, that model is exported throughout the transatlantic world. And by that time, the plantation economy was the primary driver of goods, people, and services. This created imbalance in the human-environment relations in the region and led to increased vulnerabilities faced by these islands.
So we know that heritage is a broad topic with many components. And as I mentioned before, we're going to look at this through the lens of archaeology and traditional ecological knowledge, or I'll just say TEK from now on. So with insights from the past, island climate responses can provide valuable information for contemporary societies that must cope with similar challenges. Although climatic challenges may seem to be a newly unfolding or unprecedented phenomena, archaeology and paleoecological and environmental studies have directed us to a past of similar incidents of climate change, and there is evidence of the region being exposed to challenges with water and climatic fluctuations since its earliest known occupation 7,500 years ago. This research also highlighted that pre-Columbian populations in the region lived through a 6-meter rise in sea level, in relative sea levels, marked variation in annual rainfall and periodic intensification of hurricane activity. This in addition to severe periods of severe drought. A research in 2011 also indicated important climatic changes such as the period of drought with hurricanes characterizing the entire Archaic age, which was 8,000 to 500 BC, and from 4,300 BC onwards, followed by a dry spell and a decrease in the number of hurricanes. There are also 2 identified dry periods, and a major drought known as the Maya drought was identified as the most severe drought of the past 7,000 years in the Yucatan Peninsula, and was recorded between AD 700 and 900. This provides evidence of a region that is in no way unfamiliar with severe climate fluctuations and extremes. And data from around the Caribbean basin indicate that regional climate has been episodically unstable over the past several thousand years, including persistent dry periods. So climate change will always be an unfair battle for us in the region, particularly when you look at the context that how we contribute to the changing climate versus how we are impacted due to our size. And because we're often relatively isolated, and the islands are often defined by their limitations or constraints. The Lesser Antilles in particular display a clear vulnerability due to their small size. Research, however, sometimes presents a tunnel vision approach in only seeing our islands as only being at the forefront of the climate change disaster paradigm, and forgetting that there are many key lessons to be learned from the islands themselves on sustainability and, more importantly, resilience. The archaeological record and historical accounts and present-day multivocality show that in many ways, and especially for the Lesser Antilles, this is a very different, they can offer a different interpretation. So let's look first at traditional knowledge. The indigenous peoples of the region would have communicated their knowledge of dealing with climatic hazards to those who came after, who would in turn introduce lifestyles which were not only suited to the local conditions or consistent with an understanding of the local environmental context and climatic variations. The injustices faced by these communities in continuous removals, dislocations, and loss of their lands during the colonial period, and not even just in the colonial period. After that, there have been periods of environmental injustices where after each natural disasters and communities were removed from their land, and this would have impacted their continuous practices in relation to their natural environment. So this is something that you have to consider within the context of the region. So some things that would have been passed on from generation to generation to help manage the cyclical impacts of climate change are some of the things that might have been interrupted. But the dynamics between all those who came to the Caribbean are, however, reflected in today's local knowledge practices and life ways, including those informing perspectives on climate change response. And understanding the role of heritage and community is key to incorporating long-term processes of social adaptability to climate challenges and resilience. So for example, the Kalinago and Garifuna communities of the Windward Islands, who in recent years have been severely impacted by the devastating effects of Hurricane Maria or the La Soufrière eruption, rely heavily, like other indigenous and local communities, on traditional knowledge practices for adapting to such crises and building resilience for a sustainable future. Excuse me. These practices are evident in the agricultural, water management, construction techniques that are still used today by these communities to manage hurricanes, long periods of drought, and flooding. Thank you. Go ahead, please. So this slide highlights the Sandy Bay community in St. Vincent. Now, this community this is actually New Sandy Bay. There was previously a Sandy Bay community. And this is where the Kalinago people live predominantly live in St. Vincent. And they would have been removed from their previous community because they were having also flooding issues and their exposure to natural hazards. And so they were moved to this location, and you can see the perspective of the community space and the sea. And when you talk to community members and they mention the volcanic eruptions building up back land with the sea, and the fact that when they have hurricanes, then they in turn lose land again. So this is a continuous process for them, and in what they're exposed. And from the work that we have done, we have also developed a map where the community has looked at the areas of their land and their heritage that they have lost over the time due to coastal erosion. And they're actually now taking an active role in initiatives that are being developed in their space that are either going to impact them as a community or in what they can do moving forward. But we also learn how persons adapted to climate challenges. So when the earlier people who came to the region arrived, the water was readily available on some volcanic islands, but was virtually absent on most of the coral islands. And the coral islands are like Barbados and Antigua, Barbuda. And above ground water sources would have been the location of sites for habitation. So during severe droughts in extremely arid environments, water procurement and water procurement and management systems have been put in place. This slide, sorry, can you go back, please? Back, yes, back one more. All right, so this slide was done, this image was developed from research that was done in Jamaica, particularly with the Charlestown Maroons. And from there, the community had started to document ways in which they were adjusting to dealing with hazards from the river flooding constantly. So what they did was they mentioned how they built ditches around their homes to deal with flooding issues, or how they utilize stilts, or they use the grass along the riverbanks to help protect the land some more when the river would be flooding. The next image shows houses in the Kalinago territory in Dominica. And why I wanted to highlight this as a practice is the community has been promoting more and more their use of the A-frame house, or with a higher roof, to help with wind whenever there's a hurricane. And I have this smaller image on the side because it's a structure that they have said has gone through so many hurricanes and is still there. It's a little old shop, but they're saying that, you know, because it was built with this type of housing roof construction, that it has remained. And even though when they lost a lot of houses during Hurricane Maria, and the community has complained that the houses that were rebuilt did not consider their cultural, have cultural considerations, because they built houses that were different from what they were used to. And they said that this is one way in which the community can have a better voice when after disaster processes. Next slide, please. So in Barbados and other flat coral limestone islands, such as Carriacou and Antigua and Barbuda, with few above ground rivers or springs, and even the volcanic island of St. Vincent, archaeological research has provided evidence of how past populations manage the unavailability of water and the various water management strategies that are applied to conserve and obtain fresh water supplies. Strategies including sinking shallow historic wells, ditches, small natural gullies that filled with water during periods of rain and later used to support water needs for farming or living, such as in Antigua, or the use of rainwater containers, such as the use of the Queen Conch shell. In other islands, access to underwater groundwater was aided by lining holes with large ceramic pots, such as in the middle image. Go back, please. In the middle image, such a system of pot stacks was excavated at several sites and illustrate the ingenuity of these early people to accessing drinking water within a water scarce environment. So 23 pot-lined water holes were excavated at Port St. Charles in Barbados, and they have been found at other locations in Barbados, indicating a prevalence on the west and south coast. This technology was also located in other islands of the region. So you'll see there in the image in the middle is a pot stack technology. And what they did was they would turn down pots on top of each other, and they would put this in area where they had salt water, for example, and it would help them to get fresh water. And this is something that is still being practiced in the region today. The first image to my left, I think, is I'm not quite sure. Yeah, okay. The first image shows the historic wells that are in Barbuda, and these wells are still being used by the communities, and there's a lot of oral history behind them because they're still providing water for persons, for fresh water for persons on Barbuda to today. But unfortunately, a lot of those historic wells are no longer in use. But however, this one is still in use today. So the evidence of the pot stacks and wooden line wells in these countries unearthed through archaeological research have provided data as well as demonstrated continuity in the application of these innovations over time. And as I mentioned, the pot stack technology is still used today to obtain fresh water in a saltwater context. Archaeology has also provided much data on how past populations adapted to severe changes in their environment, and the ways in which these communities adapted has implications and valuable data for us today. So we can study how early settlers adapted to environmental challenges and the lessons which can be learned from the past. What we have found in the archaeological record is that there is evidence from across the region of hurricane-proof shelters documented throughout the pre-colonial Columbian period, where these structures could be repaired rapidly after a disaster, since only light constructions such as roofing and walls would need to be replaced. Windbreaks were sometimes attached to the houses, offering protection against the prevailing northeast trade winds and heavy rains. Research has also demonstrated that the main posts of the individual structures have been found to be very sturdy and dug deeply into the ground, fixed with large slabs or dug into the bedrock, providing strong support for the roof-bearing posts with an outer wall construction, sometimes made only of large posts, but occasionally from alternating large and small posts. So this is from so you see the image, right? This image shows how the posts were post holes, and they were deeply dug, and they would have slab over the top and to anchor the posts when they were constructing these houses. So also paleo-environmental data from the Anse à la Gourde site in Guadeloupe revealed that the area was particularly vulnerable to extreme weather events. And it shows that in the past, the region has been exposed to severe climatic variations. It had alternate periods of flood and drought, continuous sea level rise and coastal erosion, which have led to internal relocation of the settlement during its 4 successive phases of occupation. So because of a shift in the barrier reef connected with sea level changes, this necessitated the gradual retreat of habitation towards higher habitation grounds. So here you had the first in this time period, and then based on the environmental changes that happened, the community started to, because of the erosion that was taking place and where water was coming in, then they started to move the settlement behind to later here, the settlement has continued retreating. We're in the areas where you have beach barrier being built up, but what remains is that the settlement has, as their form of adaptation, they continue to move the settlement more inland. And this is something that we have, we're trying to explore at other sites in the region. So because of these changes, the sites have continuously sought to move more inland. So this process at these sites continued over a period of centuries, with the village moving farther and farther away from the littoral due to the continuing retreat of the coastline. And the last occupation phase at this site was around 1200 to 450, located on the highest elevations. So this is one way that we're seeing that how the archaeology is able to tell us what has happened in the coast in the past. And these are very important implications for us when we're building in the future, the current times. So archaeology has also provided evidence of where, for example, we have clay sources. For example, in Barbados, the loss of these areas has prevented us from studying production and distribution routes internally and external to the island. So even though when we lose archaeological sites, it prevents us from learning more about this adaptation in the past, as well as what we can also learn for the future. Likewise, at other sites in Barbados, where we found evidence of how windbreak technology was being used on the site. So although it may be perceived that archaeology and cultural heritage have a small role to date, there is a place for this to change due to the very nature of archaeology being about the study of interactions of the natural and social environment through time and across space. And so the opportunities for research are limitless and should be included as a priority in broader responses. And even in the IPCC Fifth Assessment Working Group report, a one-page box outlines multiple major examples of how past societies such as the Maya, Mesopotamia, medieval Viking settlements in Greenland. And then the IPCC study ends with this statement: it would be useful to consider how lessons learned from historical experience may relate to the perceived multiple environmental changes characterized by the Anthropocene, and is a strong evidence that use of the archaeological information for climate change action is not yet clearly defined or practiced. So now we look at quickly at the vulnerability in the region. And this is also one way we're looking, because in archaeological sites, we also look at how the coastline has changed over time. And this, again, has very important implications, not just for the heritage that's lost, but also for more complete studies of coastline retreat, providing valuable data in coastal planning. Now I'm going to take you through quickly the vulnerability assessment that was done in Barbados. So the sites that were used for this were highlighted and mapped as part of this vulnerability assessment, were extracted primarily from various prehistoric and historic surveys, as well as the Barbados Physical Development Plan. And these are some of the sites that were mapped. What we did was, so this was coming from the Physical Development Plan, same sites that were mapped in Barbados. And then what we did was we developed a simple vulnerability assessment that was based on level of ecosystem loss, level of development happening along the coastline, as well as looking at issues to do with exposure to the hazard or to the risk, and its sensitivity to that. And we started to look at the sites that were different categories of risk for these sites. This is only a first phase because the aim is to continue to map more sites and to move forward to capture as many sites as possible, and then to develop relevant actions in relation to these sites that are at risk. So these are sites, these are areas along the Barbadian, almost said Bayesian, Barbadian coastline that are going to be around in 2100 that are going to be at risk from a 1 meter flood level based on hazard mapping. Because a lot of the coastline in Barbados is like an estimated 18% of landmass in Barbados forms part of the low elevation coastal zone. And so this creates a lot of vulnerability along the coastline in Barbados. So as I said, this present image highlights those areas along the Barbadian coastline projected to be under the 1 meter annual flood level by the year 2100. These are issues, these vulnerability issues are caused by many things: land use patterns over time, the fact that you have low coastal areas. And so these are things that Barbados really needs to look at. These images are extracted from Whole Town, and it was from flood hazard mapping that was done. And it looks at areas along in that town that will be facing, be at risk as from 0.8 meter, 1.6 or 2 meter sea level rise. Again, we looked at these historical areas along the coastline. Historic Bridgetown is one such area that we also looked at. Historic Bridgetown and its garrison is a World Heritage Site. And we looked at the, flood risk is a serious component, sea level rise is a serious component, and acknowledging the management plan of Historic Bridgetown and its garrison. We have all of these warehouses that are in Historic Bridgetown that are all at sea level. And these are serious, these are considerations that really have to be mitigated. We have to plan for the future for these sites that are all coastal areas. This was an image that I extracted from a study that was done that looked at areas along the same Bridgetown coastline that would be at risk from coastal inundation as a result of global warming at 1.5 and 4 degrees Celsius. So again, this just highlights the vulnerability of the coastline in Barbados. And then I'll just hand over to Kevin to just wrap up.
Thanks. Right, so the usefulness of cultural data from archaeology, traditional knowledge, is how do we integrate it into governance frameworks in relation to national adaptation planning. It has implications as well for initiatives which can be developed at the community level to support resilience through heritage. A long-term perspective helps us to understand and learn from how communities have adjusted or maladjusted to these stressors in the past and how they utilize resources and various strategies. A study of these areas does not mean just to revert to the past, but as a guide to guide us to understand applications and processes, the ways of doing things that are very relevant for us in how we build, how we grow our food, how we deal with water security, how we manage flooding, where do we choose to build, and of course, how that affects both land use and coastal planning. The study of coastal archaeological sites also has implications for how we manage development in our coastal areas and what were the cyclical issues experienced by those who lived in these areas in the past. The role of citizen science initiatives is key here, and this we believe should be pursued through work in historic coastal villages, where local knowledge is key for us to understand sustainability, both for the environment and also for persons' livelihoods. Work will also include establishing critical baseline data to include not only the actual state of the coastline, but also what was captured presentation perspectives on coastal erosion, as the intent is not only to help protect the heritage, but above all, how to help to preserve community livelihoods. Importantly, and as a co-created activity, to borrow a museum term, how do we co-curate the spaces in which people live? How do we use their climate stories to create not just mitigation, but adaptation? Community engagement is central to sustainability of such public projects. Beyond the normal list of who has an interest and the customary town hall practice, where we gather the community, speak to them, and walk away, patting ourselves on the back, it's worked. Well, it has not. We need to develop and conceptualize projects where patience is key in building these partnerships, recognition of the various stakeholders, some known, others unknown. The public may have their own stories and we must listen. The structure and system to commemorate and memorialize must have built into its system not simply feedback, but consultation and management practice vested in and through the public. Heritage in the Caribbean has not been harnessed to combat the effects of climate change, at least not yet. Its disciplines, multiple methodologies, practice, and temporal examination of millennia in some instances has much to teach us about the effect and adaptation to such change. More importantly, it provides those case studies for some of the most vulnerable areas in the world, small islands. SIDS, through their work, has brought climate to a fore in advocating and having recognized the importance of heritage at the UNFCCC Warsaw Mechanism for Non-Economic Loss and Damage. Heritage and climate change is only now beginning to be viewed in a synergistic way. That needs to improve. The International Council for Sites and Monuments, ICOMOS, has created a working group entitled Climate Action Working Group and developed a climate justice and equity toolkit. Its declaration recognized the immense potential of cultural heritage to enable inclusive, transformative, and just climate action. It calls on the global community to work to realize this potential. We posit that the discipline of archaeology and our traditional ecological knowledge allows us that insight and has embedded in it the toolkit to respond to these questions. The missing parts are threefold: capacity, legislation, and funding. The perennial tripartite foundation necessary for change. The fourth, of course, is will. The changes in the management system around cultural heritage and climate change requires a paradigm shift. The solution, we believe, is multifocal and multifocal, cross-disciplinary. The merging of cultural and natural management systems, recognizing that land use management in its broader terms speaks to human interaction with the landscape. Such institutional systems must be more than the sum of its collections. They must construct a hybrid between the traditional tangible orientation of the European model and the intangible modalities of African and Asian heritage. They must embrace the oral tradition and ingenuity of storytelling, learn from both material culture and landscape, and old talk to maximize the potential to engage peripheral communities and provide solutions. By centering culture as both system and tool, we can reclaim our past and provide the means through which resilience can be embedded. In knowing our past, adapting some of its lessons to the present, we can empower communities to be sustainable, resilient, and lived. Thank you.
Well, thank you both for that very inspiring and informative presentation. I did have some questions, but want to first, well, let me ask this couple of questions first, and then I'll turn it over to the audience. But one of the things you mentioned is the flood areas that you were identifying in Barbados. And, you know, there are so many of those, but I'm wondering also what is being done now in terms of addressing that, or what are the communities, you know, are they taking action to also find ways and solutions and working?
That's an interesting one. Let me start with this. The Barbados government over the last 20 years has entered into a rewilding exercise of enlarging the Constitution River, which is a river that bisects the capital city, because it has recognized its canalization over the last 100 years has led to a lot of flooding in the neighborhoods downstream. In some of this, they were prompted, we can argue, by the community, even though the communities in some instances have actually placed their homes in dry river mouths or in alluvial plains. That practice can't change because access to land is so limited. the recognition was that they needed to do something with, well, let's call it the natural space. And what they came up with was that they needed to rewiden, redredge, and open back up the canalized river from being something that was maybe a mile of slightly stagnant water to now about 2 miles of freely moving water, because it's partly a tidal river, which is then fed by rainwater upland areas during intense rainfall. The communities got involved. Maybe not as involved as some of us would like, but that has occurred. In other areas, in areas of St. Joseph and St. John, where there's a lot of land slippage, again, communities called for action, and some of them actually assisted in putting in gabion weirs in order to control downward movement of soil. But more still needs to be done. It's still very much government dependent and not government providing access and funds for communities to grow resilience. And that is, in a way, a fault of how we are governed in the last 50 to 60 years. That does need to change. If there's something to be learned from St. Vincent and Dominica especially, it's how communities become very much resilient. And Andrea, I know, can speak to that because she's had some first-hand knowledge.
No, if you could follow up on the St. Vincent. Yes.
Okay. Well, just before I touch on St. Vincent, I also want to say that in recent years, I know that the government has, through its coastal zone unit, they have actually been starting to do some more work. With the coastal, the vulnerability of the coastline in Barbados, and they're actually putting in place some engineering works in different areas where they're trying to protect the coastline. But again, we see these as something that will not necessarily integrate cultural heritage. It's more like a general action to protect the coastline. But that is something that is being done. And I say down to switch to St. Vincent in particular, I would not say it is necessarily a across the country thing, but directly in this community, they are trying to push for things to happen to protect their coastline. They are unfortunately sometimes caught up in a disaster cycle with what's happening in the coastal areas for them. But I think that the mere fact that they have started to document what they have been losing is a very important first step, because it shows that the community wants to be active or have an active voice or to advocate more for themselves in what is happening that's going to impact their livelihoods and their lives. So that's a good step, I think.
Well, thank you very much for that. And let me turn to the audience to see if we have any questions at this particular time. Yes. Let me move. I can move. No, I can move.
Okay, thank you, Kevin and Andrea. That was a really interesting presentation from so many lenses, because in my discipline of disaster management, it's always eye-opening to see the perspective of different sectors on this issue of climate change implications for this sector. So I really had two questions. One was related to so Kevin hinted at the point about governance arrangements and really needed to bring traditional knowledge to the table in the adaptation discussions for climate change. So my first question is, for you, what would that ideal governance structure look like? Like, who do you think needs to be there at the table? And I'm interested in knowing this because at SEDIMA, we do have the opportunity for influencing discussions with governments on the national coordination mechanisms that are looking at adaptation issues. So I just want to get a sense as to, you know, who do we need to have there? You mentioned community, but, you know, on the heritage side, for example, are there any other thoughts on that? And then the second question I had, so being a Barbadian, I was actually a little bit alarmed just seeing the number of cultural heritage sites that are potentially under threat from the 1 meter sea level rise. So my question is, what are the plans to address this? Because time is not on our side, as we have learned from the presentations, even yesterday evening when Dr. Farrell did his presentation. So what is the thinking of cultural heritage practitioners on how we try to preserve that heritage in the face of sea level rise and you know, potential other implications that come with that, including storm surge with hurricanes, etc. Thank you.
Yeah, two very heavy questions or comments. Regarding the governance framework, one of the pathways that we've been looking at is through national development strategies or documents. So for example, we know some countries have what you term a Vision 2030 document, or even though we'll have to start looking beyond 2030. But this is a very important step. Some countries also have resilience strategies. So what we've been doing, and this is a framework that we've been trying to test in Jamaica, actually. So it includes the Climate Change Division has this initiative where they've brought together different sectors in the country. Unfortunately, culture, which is where we've accepted that culture is placed right now, is considered under tourism for the planning purposes, not at the national level, but because heritage attractions are sites that might be considered as tourism sites, but culture as a sector itself is not considered just like that. But they're looking at how, for example, the Planning Institute, they're looking at what are the strategies that they can put in place at or incorporate in at the national level, and if they need what needs to be considered for national adaptation planning, which is something that they're looking at right now. So one of the things that that the culture ministry is now trying to do is to try to advocate for bringing in different associations, for example, the builders, who can talk about what are the applications that are relevant for us to consider moving forward in how we do things. So I use the builders as an example because we're looking at, for example, how to build more resilient structures moving forward. So the aim is to look at what can be learned from these different stakeholders, and the communities are part of that stakeholders, and see how that can be integrated into the national adaptation planning document that is being done for the 2030 documents have already been developed, but these are things that will be examined further post 2030 to develop other documents. So we're trying to look at it from the lens of a medium-term, long-term perspective. The other thing too is in Dominica, and this is an entryway that we're looking at. They're trying to be, as the Prime Minister says, the first resilient, I think it's the first resilient, climate resilient country. So they actually have a resilience document. And they also have a Kalinago resilient document that talks about how their traditional knowledge should be integrated into planning at the country level. So what we're trying to do as a first step is to see how to bring everybody together. Thankfully, in Dominica, the Minister of the Environment is also the Minister of Kalinago Affairs. So we're trying to see how to get some traction there. But from the focus group sessions that I had in the community, they are interested in such an approach, and to see how they can delve some more into this resilience. Because I think when they developed this document, they did not think too much about how can you better integrate traditional knowledge and climate science, because one is just an informal climate science and the other is the more formalized. So it's just trying to integrate the two better, but that will take a lot of consultation.
Thanks, Andrew. The only thing I can add to that, because you asked who should be there, the people need to be there. And I'll use Barbados as the example. We have local DEMs working, but we need to go a little bit deeper. There needs to be a real consultation at a constituency level, because I want to break it down into easy bites. Who are the old people in that area? How long have they been living there? What are the changes that they've seen? I think that provides us a particular historical perspective and lens through which to understand how has this settlement area changed? What have they seen in their lifetime? What have they heard maybe 2 or 3 generations before? And using that knowledge to build into the framework of how do we go about being resilient? That's 1. 2, the resuscitation and capture of traditional knowledge. And in this, we need to do both the tangible and the intangible. And intangible in terms of, you've got a master joiner, why don't we pay him a little bit more to actually teach people in that community his particular skill set to rebuild particular houses in a particular way? But beyond that, the other intangible is the area might be an area where a particular species of plants or series of plants grow that people use within traditional medical practice. Again, we don't necessarily think of these things because, oh, plant will always grow back. Not necessarily true. So there's a tangible and intangible component in this. And then let's call it church groups for the one hand, let's call it sporting or leisure organizations. And to use the informal term, the young men on the block, if there's a block, also need to be part of the system. Because what you're trying to do here, you're trying to, in fact, democratize the space, both for feedback and implementation. So in what we discussed, the monitoring now is at the local level. It feeds or should feed into a larger parish level, which feeds into a national level. We tend to always do things top down. I think we need to take the time to build from bottom up. And it becomes critical for everything. I'll use this as an example. There was a major highway built in the north of the island in the 1980s. There's a wonderful story that an old man who lived in the area reminded them, but you're cutting right across a dry river stream, and you shouldn't do that. The engineers ignored him. As soon as that road was built, within a month, there was a major set of rain that they had not seen for 10 years. The town got flooded because they simply blocked the channel. And what level rose and rose, it rose to the height of the road, and that town got inundated in the space of a couple of hours, simply because the old man said something and no one listened. Guess what? He was right. So again, part of the consultation, in amongst the noise of people saying, oh, but you're doing it wrong, we do in fact need to listen and have that consultation. Beyond that, and that's question 1, because I know we don't have a lot of time. Beyond that, what do cultural heritage practitioners need to do? How do we plan to address this? Multi-pronged. If we don't have the policy in place, if we don't have the legislation in place and we don't have the policy in place for preservation and conservation, then we're going to be in trouble. We can't save everything. But what we need to do is know where everything is and what the state of it is as well. And then make a really informed, critical decision. If this is this important to you, you have 2 choices. You build up your coastal defenses or move it. That might seem radical, but it's happened around the world. We argue that we don't have a lot of land space. Maybe you don't need a lot of land space. We need to get above that 10-meter and 20-meter terrace. And we should be relatively okay. But we first need to know what we have. And we still don't know what we have. And part of that is about funding. Part of that is about access. So for me, it all comes down to data. We need to know what it is, where it is, what's the state of its conservation, and then make some really hard decisions about it. But to get everyone involved. And I think that if we were to do the grassroots up, we will have a better orientation and understanding of what's there. You educate people along the way, they educate you in turn. It must be that feedback mechanism, which we are not very good at in this region. And we learn from that. And I think that's critical. Because again, the other thing about culture and heritage, it is what is passed down. So if you don't know what to pass down, it's lost. So part of the critical is how do we educate ourselves in that? And I think that will create a better monitoring system, because people now realize that they have a role to play. And once people have a role to play, you might find that they're a bit more receptive to what can be said or what can't be. How do we pass down particular traditional knowledges? But at this point in time, we still don't know enough of where everything is. And we must understand that things change. So a particular house in an area or tree in an area might become important. It wasn't important 100 years ago or 50 years ago, but it's important now because it speaks to how that community has evolved. And we've got to accept that. And the best example of that is in Barbados, the central bank built a headquarters in the 80s, dislocated an entire urban village. But the people in the area used to congregate under tamarind trees, almost like our version of an evergreen. And during the construction, that tree was actually saved. It had a dedicated watering system. It got washed down every day because it was less than 10 meters away from the main construction area. But the recognition was that the tree was so important to the identity of the community that even though you had moved out 80% of the community, that tree still needed to be there as a symbol of what that community was. Today, that entire community has been relocated, but the tree and the importance of the tree resonates with those who pass through the area. So that, again, you listen to the people and you mitigate the best way we can. We don't listen and we don't mitigate, and we need to.
Well, thank you. Thank you both. I was just going to say, no, thank you both for those inspiring words as well as this presentation. I think. Yes. So we're going to come to conclusion. I apologize for that, but I think everyone can admit that this was an excellent presentation. I just want to thank you all, both Andrea Richards and Kevin Farmer, for your presentations today. Let's give them a round of applause. I think we learned a lot from this, especially on this session called Heritage for All, Building Resilience and Preserving Culture. And I think one of the things that we all must take away from this is that everybody's voice counts and everybody needs to be heard, because we all have a message. And we all know that preserving our culture is one of the key things for us to actually identify with whom we are and where we're going. So with that, I will conclude. My name is Clinton White. I'm your moderator. I'm with USAID, the Agency for International Development. And I want to thank everyone for taking the time to join us. Thank you and have a great day.